I hardly have to say my name for once. But still, I wrote this and I'm going to read. My name is Peter Carey. I've just come from an MFA class where my students have all, here they are, here are you, have all been reading Bill Cheng, who once sat where they sit now. And of course, as you can see, tonight's event is for everybody. It's actually really only for those who are here, our current students, most of all. Bill will read a little, talk a little, but most of all, I hope and trust he'll respond to these particular readers who have questions ready for him. What shape the night will take, I really cannot guess. I'm only here because long ago, Bill was my student. And so I have a chance to tell you why I've always admired him. First, he possesses two qualities which I always look for in literature, which I value more than almost anything else. First is voice. So I don't need to explain to any of you about that. If you've read Southern to Cross the Dog, you'll know particularly what I mean. Bill Cheng do the voices. The second quality I value is a writer's courage to go far beyond their own small life. Bill's life is actually not small, it's a medium large. But he does have both these rare qualities, which I expect him to demonstrate soon. He is also modest, persistent, and patient. He was rejected on his first application to Hunter. That he applied again says something about him, that he also has will and stamina. It also says something about the nature of talent, that is not a shining crown that you are born with, that's something you nurture and grow in a process that's never finished. Bill also has another quality, which is not unimportant. Let me explain. When his first story was accepted, and I think it was the first story that Grant had published, it probably wasn't your first published story.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. Bill wasn't there when his first story was published. But when Nicole Araji became his agent, and when she saw his book, I was embarrassingly excited. Bill, he was annoyingly restrained at every step. He would not go anywhere further than to say, we'll see. Now, we all know soon that writers whose characters get messed up by their own success. Bill Cheng is not one of them, and never will be. As for how he'll do tonight, we'll see.
Okay.
You can take your mask off if you want to.
Yeah, take your mask off.
Thank you.
All right, well,
I'll be the most
Take your mask off so we can hear you.
Bam, this is what I look like. Is anyone here not from the program? Okay. All right, okay. I had a plan for tonight in terms of how to go through this book and contextualize being here at this moment. So I started this book first year at the MFA program. That would be around 2009 or 2008 or so. Finished it 2 years after the program. By finished, I mean finished the first complete full draft. So that means that we're coming up on 10 years on this friggin' book. So it's a little, I'm telling Scott and Jason back there, there's a good likelihood this is my last, this is the last time I'll be talking publicly about this book. And I feel like that sort of makes sense. It rhymes and it rhymes. That makes any sense. Because it's predominantly students here tonight, normally the format's sort of like, I'll read some, we'll talk some, I'll read some, we'll talk some. Maybe we can break this up a little bit differently by just having you guys ask questions about the pieces that I read. I certainly have stuff to say about them. I will also say that in preparation for tonight, I reread this 10-year-old book, which if you ever get a book that's 10 years old, it's an interesting experience, for sure. So I dug up this copy somewhere on my shelf at home, and it looked exactly like this with this slip of paper. And there's a little postcard in there as well from my publisher, it's sort of an appreciation note. But this slip of paper, well, the back of it says exemption application for homeowners, and I have no idea what it refers to. There's an address on here. It says 4558 Vernon Boulevard, LIC Bar, 46th Avenue. So this was a place I went to do a reading, and I checked and there's something written on the back, which I will be reading here tonight. And I checked my email before I got here about when was the last time I was at 4558 Vernon Boulevard. It was in 2015, which would mean that the last time I read from this book at all was probably 2015. So what do you need to know before I read this piece? When I was in high school, I grew up in a town called Bayside, out in Queens. One of the major high schools there, the high school I went to is called Benjamin Cardozo High School. And during my time there, we had a teacher named Matt Stryker. And Matt Stryker's claim to fame was that he was fired from his job because he used one of his sick days to perform at the WWE. And that's the only context I will give you for this piece. If you ever fly out of LGA, look out the window and you'll find my hometown. From the air, it won't look like much. A cluster of cells packed tight into the furthest corner of eastern Queens. Block after block of ranch houses and Dutch colonials laid under the fumes and roar of a commercial airline flight path. This is Bayside, a suburb vivisectioned into lopsided cuts by motorways and boulevards, the Cross Island, the Clearview, the LIE. My Queens is a New York of open sky, a place without subways, with easy traffic and room to breathe. In Bayside, the Bridge and Tunnel Club are primping in their miniskirts and muscle shirts, and the bartenders at the Crazy Moose stock test tube shooters of Alizé. And slick young Greeks are cruising in their freshly detailed cars down Union Turnpike, calling out malakas on the street. And outside Cardozo High School are the Asian boys with their coiffured hair, sneaking cigarettes and working on their skulls. And the goths are at the bus stop, adjusting their studded chokers. And in the handball courts, there's a sound like popcorn as knobby-jointed teams smash their targets into outer space. And the post-dawn fishermen are balancing their tackle on handlebars. They say a prayer to the ocean gods and pedal towards Little Neck Bay. And to the north, members of the 65th New York Infantry mount Rodman guns on the high walls of Fort Totten on watch against rebel gunboats headed for New York Harbor. And the weekend dads are holding court over lawnmowers. And a teenage Ron Jeremy sits up in bed, anxious about his future. And on the bayfront, Rudy Valentino, Gloria Swanson, and Charlie Chaplin are looking for a fourth for a game of mahjong. And bootleggers are screaming down the private raceway of William K. Vanderbilt II on their hooch deliveries out to the island. and Veronica Lucan keeps bumping into the Virgin Mary, and the Matinacock Indians are stringing wampum, and William Jefferson Clinton is at the Future Diner, shaking hands and wiping grease from off his fingers. And this is the line I struck when I was at the LIC bar. And Matt Stryker is counting his sick days as he gets body slammed by Kurt Angle. And from the hills, you can see the Throgs Neck Bridge, and the parks are huge like wildlife preserves, Crocheron and Cunningham and Halipod, where the Latinos grow up as Storm and the Pakistanis stake out a pitch for weekend cricket. And this is where I almost swerved my bike into incoming traffic. And this is where I popped my arm out of its socket. And these are the backyards we used to haunt. I grew up on the shoulders of the LIE. This is the place that made me. Now that I read it, I guess I wrote this because it was one of the first, if not the only Queen's reading I did, or I was ever invited to do. Okay, so that's that. Any questions?
Is that one sentence or two?
Son of a bitch is 2 sentences.
Thought so.
Okay. See what I have in my notes here. Okay, so I said I reread this book after, I don't know, 2015 or so. And it's a book that, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but some of it doesn't work so much for me anymore. Some of it I still quite like. But there is a section, there are some sections that I used to read quite a lot that I felt quite proud of when I was reading them. And you'll see that over time, I started to make these sort of notations to say like, okay, don't read this part, don't read this, little edits to sort of make your reading sound better than your writing actually was. I'm not gonna do that for you tonight. You're just gonna get the raw, like unfiltered, gross prose that came out, that the publisher accepted. So I'll talk about this first section. This first section is the prologue of the book. The prologue came out of a workshop here at Winter College. The professor teaching at the time, Colin McCann, had suggested that I write this prologue. This didn't exist in the earliest drafts, as a way to sort of deal with some of the challenges I was facing. I had a hard time entering the sort of main character of this kid, Robert Chatham, and his path into manhood. And in writing this prologue, it became a way to sort of enter into the character more, and it also sets up a lot of the sort of preoccupations of the novel itself. So I'll read that part first. When I was a baby child, they put the jinx on me. It was in my drink and food and milk. And when I ran, it heavied in my bones, and when I sang, it stopped up my throat. When I loved, it leapt for me, hot and poisonous. I saw it in my daddy, the hard lines of his face, that uneasy rope, how in his years he didn't lift his feet, but slid them, soles across this gritted earth. It settled in my mama, trembled her voice and blanked her eyes. My brother Billy locked it inside him, and it carried him low into the deep earth, silting then into the river and dew and air, and the moths and bee catchers, borne skyward, and as will be lowered again, into earth again. It's dusking. There goes the sun. There goes sky and cloud and light taken into that black horizon, and I know I am bad crossed. I see its lines. It reaches up, arcs, it cuts through me, it draws me on and dogs me down to that place where I am bound. When it is I borne down, my eyes and mouth stitched with gut, and they take my balls and brain and heart, and that deeper black claims me wholly, then let me meet that some bitch at his eye, for I know my name's been read, Robert Lee Chatham, in his book. So that's that. You're gonna get the same kind of thing from me after every answer, because I am not good with transitions. Are there any questions or reactions or responses to that opening? Okay, sir?
Yeah, I know that you derived a lot of inspiration for the blues in writing this, and I thought it was interesting that this prologue and also your epilogue are what kind of felt the most song-like to me, as a sort of a lot of it feels like prose poetry, but this feels almost just like poetry. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were beginning in the novel in this way.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So in revisiting this book, I had to remind myself that the project, the sort of like top line of the project was go off and write a blues novel, and I didn't. So for me, that meant two things. It was first accessing this sort of system of images, right, that sort of repeats itself in different blues songs and different blues legends. And I actually find that a lot of that piece of that attempt doesn't sit well with me now. But the other part was just trying to capture a sense of music, right? And I've selected some of the excerpts tonight based on the sort of rhythms that I feel like in the process of drafting it. This is going to sound absolutely ludicrous, but I hear something very particular in the cadence of the words. There's a reason why like certain chapters have had things like cut out and added back in different readings. That's because I'm finding different rhythms every time I do a reading, and so I like no, the melody doesn't sound like that, and I have to like retool it. Now, whether or not that appears to readers, it probably doesn't. But for me, the whole book, or at least the bulk of the book, is trying to find a particular kind of cadence. What was your question?
I think you about got it. I mean, I was wondering why. I connected your prologue to, I think, just called the epilogue, which maybe you're going to read later on. I was just interested in you beginning and ending it with the way that's the musicality is maybe even more elevated than the rest of it.
I wasn't going to read it, but I can do it right now. I mean, I got the book right here. No reason not to. So I would imagine most of you have read the book at this point, or said you've read the book. You'll know that most of it's in third person, but there are these spaces where first person is sort of introduced, and the prologue is one, epilogue is another, there are a few other places. And I was looking at it in terms of how these first person sections are deployed, and the ways that they're different, if they are different. So what the prologue strikes me as, it very much feels like an invocation, right? It very much feels like there's something this character is trying to say to something higher than himself, right? And I always think it's something, it's a habit I picked up here, but that when you are writing, particularly in first person, but also in cases of third person as well, so really understand or have a concept or model in your mind of who is talking, why they're talking, who they're talking to, right? And so I think some of that still bears out in this reread. So the ending of the book. Oh, okay. The first line of this, first line of the epilogue comes from a song by the same name. I believe it was written or at least performed by R.L. Burnside, maybe? I hear my black name ringing, here through these lowlands, a basin full of sky and aching, here through the towns I've worked and bled and danced and loved. Here I hear my black name ringing, in the fields and levee camps and steel mills, in the outturned churches and shotgun shacks, my black name rings, bright and searing as the day. Outside, the grasslands plunge. I see where my mama was born, an earth cabin where the ground comes up to the walls. There's clothing on the line, and the jumpers catch the wind, dancing personless. And down the way is the creek where they baptized me, where I killed my first fish and I told a lie to feel a girl beneath her skirt. They raised a town and we built again. For months the trees were full of ash. Here are the notches on the bows. Here's where I stole. Here's where they stole from me. Here my mama closed her eyes and rested her head on a pillow of air. Here's a coin in my hand. And still the country rages on, sad, full. A cape of blue raised high over its spruce and elm and hillocks, the villages and shanty towns. I dance in every hall, I beat my hands against the walls, the country rages, I rage. The sun rises, I pass Leland, Indianola, and Moorhead, where the Southern Cross the dog. She whirls and laps and foams, and through the air are the long slack ropes that carry spark and light. And I will follow her down past the watering station, the grain elevator, a grove of Warren pears, at last into town, down a road to a high building made of brick and mortar. They'll put me in a suit and comb me in my hair, and I'll make my bracelet shine. And there I will stand and meet that man in a long black robe. And for you I will sing and dance and stop my feet to beat the devil. It's the epilogue. There's a part in here that's sort of, I hadn't read Cormac McCarthy until well into finishing the earliest drafts of the book. But the one piece that is kind of really sort of taken by was, what's the one where like, it's the kid and the judge? Gwen Meridian. Right, there's the ending of Gwen Meridian where they're like posting the posts into the telephone, either the telephone or electric wire post. I was really sort of struck by that image of like modernization, and so kind of lifted it a little bit, I guess. So that's that. So back to the beginning. I used to read the first chapter of the book a lot, and you can sort of see, I said there's like, my concept of what a blues novel was sort of this system of images. And there's a kind of mythic quality to the book as well that sort of intersects with that. And I wonder if any of that starts to creep up just as the book begins. The rain kept on like a dust, and it was the oldest boy, GD, who said it wasn't nothing, crossing through the woods behind old man Crookhands. The wind swooped through chattering branches and blew the grit against their faces. They put up their hands and trudged on, GD ahead of the others, cutting his switch into the bushes. Whack, whack, come on, you babies, he said, and he whipped again, the vines and leaves opening around his blows. They followed close, the boys wolfing on, whispering their jokes, trying to make the girls laugh and shiver. One at a time, they crushed across the underbrush, skimming spider bites and breaking off bits of sweet bark from the trunks to chew and spit. The trail began to climb, and GD bounded up the hills in wide strides, and at the top, he stopped and waited for the others. You could see Crooken Grove, a cleft of cleared land that dipped below the path. At the center was the bone tree. It had been dead for years, its leaves rotting in a carpet around the trunk. One by one, the others crowded around him. They gazed out into the grove and fell quiet. There had been stories about dead Indians and their ghosts living inside the hollows. The wind came through and the naked branches clattered. The gang looked at one another, then up at GD. He spit a wad down into the grove. Keep moving, he said. The mule path broke out into a clearing where the lumbermen had already come through. GD chose the tallest tree stump and mounted it. He splayed out his arms, waving the switch like a sword before touching the edge against his cheek, a nub of twig snagging on his tooth. It was time. His eyes drooped into lazy buttonholes, looking the others over. They fidgeted under his gaze, shifting from side to side, holding up their hands, rubbing rain into their fingers. GD sized them up, their ragged clothes, the yellow mud caked to their shins. A girl unbraided a sweep of hair, her small fingers eased through the knots. The boy dug his toes into the soil, trying not to meet GD's eye. Another stood with his arms folded across his chest, shifting his weight from knee to knee. He spotted her. She was tall and willowy compared to the other girls. Her hair was brushed back and she sloped her shoulders as she tried to hide her size. GD pointed with the switch. Dora, he said. Girl furrowed her brow. Not me. He moved the switch to the sharp of his smile. Yes. That's not fair. I done it last time, GD. You, Dora, again. It's going to rain, she said. I don't want to get soaked. GD shrugged and grinned at the others. Let's get started then. GD brought the switch down against his leg. Thwack. He made a circle around her. He beat down again. Thwack. Thwack. The girl looked up, but it was too late. Already the circle had tightened and they had begun to sing. Little Sally Waters, setting in a saucer. Rise, Sally, rise. Wipe her weeping eyes. The girl sighed, slumping. She hunched down on her knees and listened for the rhythm. Her backside bucked up, kicking out like a mule and swinging. Shake it to the east, Sally. Shake it to the west, Sally. Shake it to the one you love the best, Sally. Her frilled bloomers flashed out into her dress as she spun. The world swished inside her head. When the song ended, she righted herself and turned to see who she'd chosen. If it was a girl, they would have to start again, this time even faster, as GD lashed out mercilessly with his switch. Slowly, the world glided back into place. She righted herself and saw him. He was big-cheeked and wet-eyed, and he was at least a good head shorter than her. The boy looked blankly at her through his long lashes. She'd seen him before. He was always so quiet, never laughed or cussed, floating behind the others like some tattered kite tail. He fidgeted now, with his hands in his pockets, looking unsure of himself, until GD nudged him forward. Or don't just stand there looking dumb. GD led Dora and the boy out to Crooken Grove, where the earth was cracked and split along the roots of the bone tree. They were alone, the three of them caught under the storm clouds. Thunder sounded out like split wood. They looked cautiously at the little bits of sky coming through the branches. Gigi took both their hands and grinned. My, Dora, I never knew you was such a tasteful lady. Dora slapped his arm and his eyes sparked. I'm gonna count to 100, then you come on out. You know how it works, GD. GD winked at the boy and headed back to the clearing, arms crossed over his head. She could hear him beginning to count. Dora smoothed down the sides of her dress. The boy was looking at a spider threaded between two branches. It sat fat and blood-filled in its web, its legs spread like fingers. Dora could hear the other children starting in on their singing again. They had begun another round. Well, come on then, she said. Come on what? Had you played Sally Water before? The boy plucked up the spider. He turned it over and watched its legs bicycle. He held it up to Dora and she made a face. Then she set it down on the trunk and watched it race up the bark. You're Billy Chowden's brother, ain't you? The boy shrugged. My uncle told me your brother was wild, that he loved up a white girl, and Dora stopped herself. The boy sat down against the trunk and started scabbing at the bark, pulling it away in chips. He put them together in a pile, counting them out in his palm. What's your name? Dora asked. Robert, he said. He seemed to think for a moment, then he added, Robert Lee Chowden. Dora looked back from where they came. Let's not take too long then. Come here, she said. Stand up against the trunk there. He dusted the bark off and pushed his sleeves up to his elbow. They drooped back down past his knuckles. His shirt was too large. It hadn't been sized for him. Now shut your eyes so you can't see nothing. Everything was still for a moment. Just a slow breath of the magnolias and the sound of mosquitoes making the air goosebump and tremble. He thought he could hear the other children laughing in the distance, their small twinkling voices in the breeze, and he felt the kiss. The damp, spongy pressing against his mouth, something cold skimming the underside of his tongue, warm air brushing against the scope of his upper lip, something small and hard pressed into his hand. When he opened his eyes, the sky had split open. Robert ran. The ground sucked back on his feet as he slid on the loose mud. The rain smashed down, ruffled the trees, and beat the trails. He could hear the children scatter, screaming, giggling. He ran faster, twigs and leaves lashing against him, the warm sting rising into his cheek. Along the farm, the pebbled road bit into his feet. He wiped the slick off his face and sped faster, kicking from his toes. The cornfield was alive with chatter, the water running down to a trough along the road, bill bugs crunching under his soles. Robert cut across the pasture. Clouds streaked white and thundered a line above the hills. He could see his house in the distance, the rain hammering the roof into a silver froth. On the porch, he caught his breath, pulling the air deep into his stinging lungs. The pour came down through the ceiling slats and he rinsed the mud off his calves and ankles before going inside. The air was thick and sweet with the smell of char. He hung his shirt up on a nail and he warmed himself over the stove, bringing his hands over the flame and feeling the cold run out from his fingers. His daddy came in from the other room. "Where you been, Robert?" He sat the boy down and toweled him off with the flap of his shirt. "You know your mama don't want you out in them woods." Robert said nothing, just let his daddy's big hands comb roughly over his hair and neck and chest. His daddy sighed. He peeled off the wet clothing from Robert's body and sent him to the basket for a dry shirt. Robert checked it for beetles, snapping it over the fire before putting it on. His daddy lifted the lid off the kettle, and the steam rose up over his face. He peered in and dragged his finger down the gray stipple of his beard. "Dinner will be ready soon. Go on and get your mama." Robert watched her from the doorway. She was in her chair, her quilt drawn up over her shoulders, staring out into the rain. Outside, the mule was ducking under the shed, twitching its ears and blinking. Robert went in and touched her limp hand. She looked at him, her eyes traveling along the edge of his face, then his eyes, nose, mouth. Then she pulled Robert into her and started raking her hands across his hair, making sounds that were almost words. He could feel her strong fingers pressing into him, her body a volcano. She kissed the top of his head, his cheeks, her thumb rubbing at the ridges of his ears. "It's time to eat," Mama said. "It's time to eat, Mama," he said. He slipped his small hand inside of hers and slowly helped her to her feet. She could hear the breath shift inside of her body clenching and then letting go. "This way," he said, walking her into the other room. His daddy had already set out the bowls and scooping up hominy mush with a flat stick. Robert sat his mother down and settled into the seat beside her. Then when his daddy started to grace, Robert bent his head into his hands and shut his eyes. Rain crashed above him and he pictured to feel the birds thumping their black wings. His daddy finished and Robert took a spoonful and worked the mush around in his mouth. "How is it, Robert?" It was bland and rubbery, but he didn't complain. "I know it ain't nothing like your own cooking, Etta." His mama stared into the steam. Her lips were drawn back on her round face, the edges of her eyes puckered. His daddy shook his head and picked up his spoon. "Me and the boy, we do miss your cooking. Ain't that right, Robert?" Robert said nothing. He lifted his gaze up from his bowl and let it drop back down. "I remember when you used to cook up those ribs. Could smell them coming a mile down the road. And Skinny, he'd be saying, 'Ellis, what you smiling at?' And I wouldn't say nothing. Just walk back here with that big grin on my face. Robert, you're too small to remember, but your mama used to cook them ribs so good, even that damn mule will try to get itself inside. You imagine a mule eating ribs? That ain't something else. He'd stay out there by the window making a fuss like it was his day of judgment. You remember that, Etta?" His daddy reached across the table and touched her arm. She didn't move. He sighed and dug his spoon into the meal. "Ain't no mule out the window now, is there?" The fire had gone dead in the night, but the smell of scorched wood stayed in the air. Robert opened his eyes. His mama was still asleep, her arms crossed over his small body. He listened to her breathing, low and ragged, as her breast pushed into his back. Under the pillow, he found the cold, smooth stone Dora had put into his hand. He rolled it around in his fingers and conjured her up in the dark ceiling, her eyes, her lips, the weak taste of her mouth. There was something about her skin, damp and sticky. He could feel it spreading across his hand. The urge to piss swelled inside him. He climbed out of bed. He could hear the rain dripping from the ceiling into the rain pots. He took his brother's coat from the wall, swung it around him. Out back, he unbuttoned his pajamas and pissed a hot stream into the darkness. He went back inside. The chair where his daddy slept was empty. The light crept up from behind the front window and splashed out onto the floor. It burned in a circle through the fog glass. He watched it, pulling the sag of the coat around him, thinking about his mama's ghost stories, the way the devil could come in through a keyhole. So that's that section. I don't know why you're clapping. That was terrible. I think there are real criticisms with that section. Like, I think there are, from the vantage point of where I stand now, I think the language is in some places a little bit much, and it's kind of weird to be up here talking shit about my book, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I talked a little bit about like the system of images. Is that just another way of saying cliche? Right? Is that just another way of saying like not doing the work of fully investigating or bringing out nuance, the things you want to use for your work, right? So there are you know, there's something about some of that dialogue that feels a little bit cliche to me now, or a little bit stock to me now. What do you guys think about that? Donna?
Well, it doesn't seem like that is the goal that you in your graduate reading from here. I'm still struck by the propulsion of your prose. I'm still struck by the rhythms of your work. And although you're reading rather quickly tonight, in the way that I think people read work, that they feel like, okay, I've done this, I'm doing something else now. I just want to know, when you were working on this and when you were revising this, were you reading out loud?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Because that's because I can feel that in the work. I can feel that you must have worked really hard on that syntax and on the rhythms of your language, so that's my question.
So, yes, I still do, but I don't do it in the way that a normal person would do. So they write a thing and then they're in the process of editing, they read it out loud, and what I do is that I mouth it as I'm writing it, and I do a lot of my writing in public. I, have a little laptop thing, and I go to a coffee shop or place with free Wi-Fi, and I'll just be the guy who's making weird sounds as he's typing, right? Things that like almost come off as words. It's quite irritating to anyone who's sitting nearby. And it's something I still do, even if the work itself is not intended to be particularly lyrical, or I guess I want all work to be propulsive, but like, if it's not particularly lyrical, I'll still, this is an obsession. This is not something that I feel that most writers or should emulate, but like this obsession with sound and rhythm and cadence is something that I feel like is a large part of my process. But it can also be like damning, right? Because if you privilege that above other things, where are you writing yourself into? All right. So I have like half a dozen different sections here that I could read. I mean, I have a whole book I can read.
Can I just ask a follow-up on that? Because I sort of, it's so rich what you just said. So can you describe any like effort or way that because you're articulating that so clearly about knowing what you yourself privilege and how you go about working, have you ever like consciously put it aside and said, I want to plot, and here's the plot coming in? I mean, in a way, I kind of feel like I know the answer, but it's very hard to do.
Yeah.
It's hard to get rid of your own, or sort of put aside your own way in, but I'm just curious.
There are certainly like, I sort of tackle every writing project with a different intention, right? So like, not just an intention about the thing I want to talk about, but in many ways, like, the content drives the form, right? So if I want to talk about like, being a misanthrope out in Eastern Queens, like it doesn't have the same rhythm, doesn't have the same stylistic or like structural preoccupations as a book like this. But the thing is, like when I'm drafting, I can't move forward if I'm hitting the wrong note, right? So I can be, I can, what's the term, like walk and chew gum at the same time. So I can like keep prose moving and still do plot, kind of, sort of, but if the sound of it is wrong, I'll suddenly have to stop everything and then try to fix that piece, and that's not something to aspire to.
I'm curious, going off that, to know how much the sound of a sentence might influence the content and whether switching out one word for another changes bigger things, because is that
I mean, I think it makes sense, but I think you sort of answered it, right? Like, I think it's like when you're too obsessed with a stylistic thing, right? Like, it puts you in conflict with yourself because you also want to do this other thing. Now, like you want this character to walk into a room and do something and then leave the room. But because you have this sort of like rhythmic pattern you're trying to capture, maybe you have the character come in and do a bunch of other things in the room at the same time. So like now you're sort of like, well, why did I do that? Like, what am I going to do with all that? You know, like most readers don't care. Most readers can't even hear the thing that you're hearing. So why did you go ahead and do that? Now, most of the time, it's not about like the plot content, it's not about like necessarily like characters, but like when you're talking about like feelings and intentions and like sort of more ethereal, abstract things about like, you know, where a character's mind is at, right? Like that's kind of dangerous is not the right word, because there's nothing dangerous in this, but like it's the sense of like, oh, I'm saying something that is inauthentic to sound nice, right? I'm saying something that like I don't intend for this character to be able to have something lovely to read, which, you know, in my sort of growth as a writer, I feel like it's not as important. Okay, this reading is, I was worried, I always start every reading concerned about like, I don't have enough to read and I have way too much to read. Okay, so one of the weird, I'll leave it up to you, actually. Why not, I got you here. The process of rereading this book, I found that the old parts that I really liked in the sort of original life of this book, I didn't like so much. But I also found that like parts that I just completely forgotten about, that I'd forgotten written at all, was strangely like charming in a way that I hadn't expected. I mean, whatever, I can find myself charming, why not? So I have two sections with these sort of minor characters, Eli and Duke, and they're sort of based on, I don't know how familiar people are with like blues legend stuff, but blues legend is that this sort of like musical ethnographer John Lomax and his son Alan Lomax went to Texas and like bailed this like musician legend criminal out of like Texas jail, and so then, you know, he could record him for the Smithsonian or something like that, right? And so I can read a couple sections on them, but there's another section with Robert that just kind of does similar things that are sort of like structurally the same. So which of those two? So like hands for Robert. Okay, couple hands for Duke and Eli. All right, you guys want the minors, okay? Okay, so I'll start with Eli. So Eli is a combination of a bunch of different musical legends, right? He's like in one part, Leadbelly, right? Heidi Leadbetter. And another part, sort of Robert Johnson, sort of like tragic, like famously tragic, sold to the devil type figure. And a little bit of Muddy Water, which was highly like sexualized, like charisma that was part of his sort of performance personality. So look out for those. He was born Elijah Philip Cutter outside of Natchez in Adams County. gray and small and out of breath, a caul across his brow. When he was 2, his mama cut out to California with a man that might have been his daddy, leaving Eli to his grandma to raise up. He was a sickly boy. At night he could not breathe and would instead sit up in his bunk, his lungs filling with panic. And he'd listen, and he'd listen, the rusty harp inside his throat, the ringing of the bottle tree. When he was 5, his grandma took him down to the small one-room shack out beyond the rail yard water station. All around he could hear the great breaths of steam let out from the chimneys. The house sat out beyond the weeds, its walls soot-stained and ivied. His grandma unlatched the door and guided Eli in. There was hardly any light. He could barely make out the shelves that lined the walls, the dark, dusty jars of powder and bone. It was a great shifting breath. You almost did not see him sitting there on the bed. He was old, his eyes 2 milky orbs inside his skull. The devil's in your throat, his grandma said. It got to come out. The man laid his frail hand upon the boy's body and undid the buttons one by one. The fabric fell quietly away. On his open chest, the man pressed his ear. He listened for the rattle of his soul. When he was done, the man had him lie down on a sheet of wax paper. Eli looked at his grandma, but only nodded approvingly. And he obeyed. He spread himself out on top of the thin paper, and the man knelt down with a candle at his feet. Shut your eyes, his grandma said. Above him, the man moved, shifting his weight, the floor straining against the balls of his feet. Eli could hear his hands, hear the wet slick of oil between the man's palms as he rubbed them together. A band of warmth stretched across his chest. Don't move. And the heat was unbearable. It lay heavy like a second skin. He could feel the sweat between his shoulder blades, gathering along the ridge of his spine. It traveled down and down a cold pearl at the base of his back. And inside he could feel the small thing fighting in his chest, struggling against the root man's ministrations. The devil rustled, his lungs filled with feathers. There were hands upon him now, kneading hard against his breast. His heart raced, the air was shrinking, he could not breathe. And there was the thumping in his breast, and God's hand in his throat, and there was his soul against his ribs. Outside, the trains let out their bellows, and in one sick lurch, he spit the evil yoke out onto the butcher paper. Eli hacked and wheezed and felt air crack deep into his core. The man stood him up and wrapped up the paper around the yoke, tucking the yellow mass into one of his dusty jars. For years, Eli went to see that root man, drinking his potions and huffing powders from his mason jars. In the afternoons, he helped him hunt through the thatches of Johnson grass outside the rail yard. The old man squatted down among the weeds, his desiccated hands searching through the loose, soft soil. He plucked mushrooms from the cold black ground and tucked their caps inside his cheek. He'd hold them there for hours before spitting the running mash across an Indian head penny. All the plants he could name by touch, the grittiness of the leaves, the firmness of the stalks against his fingers, sorghum and boneset and chase devil. He'd take a spade and dig down, prying up long tangles of bloodroot and John the Conqueror and the musky dripping vines called devil's shoestrings. Folks would come from miles round, as far away as Pritchard and Mobile and Tillman's Corner. The line was stretched out the door, and Eli would watch them, their slack and tired faces, the nervous hands. Eli listened as the rootman dispensed his advice, mashed up snake root and groove burr in a sachet under your bed, a strip of yellow cloth and powdered anise seed inside a flannel pouch. There were tricks for money and tricks for love and tricks to turn the devil from your door. There were mojo hands and eel eyes and black cat bones, and all around was the invisible world, Eli realized, each of us caught in its strange currents. If he shut his eyes, he could almost hear it, the thump of blood, the driving noise, the deep and ancient undertows. The first trick he ever laid, Eli made a wish and rubbed a piece of lodestone through a purple kerchief. He buried the rock underneath the linden tree and burned the kerchief, setting the ashes into the wind. In time, the universe would answer. When he was 13, a man came to his grandma's house. He was tall and dark and slim with a mouthful of gold, and he told the boy that he was his father. With him, he brought an old pine-top upright piano. The man said he had a job selling them all over the country. When Eli's grandma found that man inside her house, she ran him off with a meat cleaver. She chased him clear out of town before he could recover his piano. For hours every night, Eli would sit at the box, studying the keys. He'd pry open the top panel and watch the wooden hammers rise and fall across the long raking cables. He taught himself, and in time, the piano became almost second nature. He liked the way his arms spread its length, the way the sound gave underneath his fingers. It became a conduit of his will. Anger and joy and sadness swooping out of his soul and into the air. Yet when he sat himself at the bench, when the full board lifted away to reveal the peninsula of glowing keys, he could not say he was entirely himself. The hands were not his hands, they moved without his moving them, tensing into claws, doing their jibber jump. The chords rose like the heat above the keys, and the thought occurred to him that maybe it was not his will that drove his hands, that spanned his arms, that struck and stroked and stomped his feet against the ground. I selected this passage because I wanted to talk a little bit about, and this is sort of connected to the first piece I read, which is the Queen's piece. People look at this book and they look at the sort of jacket photo, and they sort of wonder at the discrepancy. The story of Eli, I think, other writers in the room can sort of speak to this, but even in the most sort of distanced fiction, I think there are pieces of autobiography, right? And so Eli's, the scene where like, I'll just tell it like this. When I was quite young, until maybe my 30s, I had very severe asthma, very severe. And my parents are Chinese, and they tried Western medicine. Like I got albuterol, I got like steroidal stuff, I got a nebulizer, and like none of it was making me better. And so they turned to like Eastern medicine, and I had to do some stuff that I found like quite weird, right? And it wasn't exactly like that, but it also wasn't so different from that either, right? I had like hot, like burning, it's like slices of ginger and like some sort of like herb, like smudgy herb that was like placed on pressure points, to the point where like welts would form up, and like I had to live with those for a while. I had to eat, like drink, and inhale strange things. There's a lot of breath stuff in this book. I don't know if I was conscious or not, but like that's something that sort of occurs over and over, and at least that I saw in this sort of rereading. And I think a lot of that's sort of informed by that piece of autobiography. Part of why I selected, the other part of why I selected this passage was sort of like, there's a difference, I think there's a difference between the sort of Eli third person and the sort of Robert and the kids and GD third person, right? I think there's I think fairly late into the drafting of the novel, I'd learned how to write more quickly, that is to say, cover more time and have a sort of brisker movement of plot in a way that I find more compelling than sort of slower, more moody scenes now. And that's just sort of an interesting like transition for me as a writer, right? Like I wasn't super conscious of it at the time that I was writing it, but like I certainly feel myself preferring that now. Those are the things that I found interesting, that I found fascinating about that section. What do you guys want to?
So I guess just as a follow-up to that, and a follow-up to Donna's question, so because like you said, it's a blues novel. So were you also just, as you were writing this, were you listening to blues music during the process of writing, and specific pieces for specific inspirations for different scenes, different settings?
I think yes, but also like I'd listen to a whole. I mean, it wasn't a blues. I didn't start listening to blues music because I wanted to write a blues novel, right? I've been listening to blues for years and years before that, and so I had this store to draw from. Now, yeah, of course, I'd have it on when I was working some of the time, just to, I guess in some ways, I could help me find the rhythm I need. But like, I didn't have to like look up John the Conqueror or Black Cat Bone or anything like that. That was stuff I already had in my pocket.
So time for a handful of other questions, but also I wanted to, also pulling on Donna's question about your thesis reading. I happened to be at that reading as well, and that that reading was just very much burned in my mind. So I'm wondering about what your experience was like taking the work that you did for your thesis, and how did that sort of morph, and how did you draw that into this work?
I feel like a lot. So what's interesting is that there was a medicine show sequence, I think, at the thesis reading. Is that right? And I was reading this book. I was like, where is it? I love to read it, right? Like I read it a bunch. It's like it was a weird piece. And I read through this book. I was like, it's not here. Like I must have cut it. And I had no memory of cutting it. It was probably like a hard and difficult cut. That being said, I feel like I think I left. What's the thesis? 80 pages plus, right? Probably the 80 pages plus is like a fidelity of about 85% from the original, and then it's just the rest of it was sort of like building it out. We can talk about the challenges. And like now that I have more wisdom, like how I would address those challenges now. Okay, so one of the challenges is, and I think I alluded to some of it earlier, it was just like these characters just aren't doing enough, I just can't see my way into them so much, right? And so part of that was just like, okay, we'll give them some like first person sections, and then like we can sort of check off that list that like, okay, now the reader knows the character because he introduced himself and he told everybody what he was all about, right? Which is, kind of a cheat. And the like there is no like what it strikes me as now is just like understanding the characters better, right? So again, we talked about this sort of like system of images, right? So, but if you have a person as an image, what that means is that you're not able to sort of like allow nuance and strangeness and like surprise into that character, and that's why like they feel static on the page. That was one challenge. Another challenge was so we talked about the blues novel, right? So a lot of blues music is about movement. It's about like people coming into town and being asked to leave, or like losing a lover, or like a lover telling you to leave. There's just a lot of movement, right? Which was sort of parts of the book that still work really well for me are those sections about movement, which I guess I'll read maybe or maybe not. But it gets to a point where the character is actually stuck in a literal swamp, right? And that was sort of a huge challenge for me because suddenly all that motion stopped. And if you're relying on motion for the momentum of the book, to not have that suddenly was quite a challenge. And I feel like I just sort of like muddled through it. It became like, that's like the romance section of the book. And this is something that I've thought a lot about in terms of like fictional constructions of wilderness. Like how do you create I can tell you how I got into the building and navigated up the floors. I can describe that sequence because like we all have this sort of like schema in our head about how buildings work and how elevators work and how rooms and hallways are set up. But when it comes to a wilderness, part of the terror of the wilderness is that the sense of place like doesn't follow the same schema. Like we have to sort of the book kind of gets away with it by like creating sub places, by like creating like physical landmarks that become landmarks, that become, yes.
But it sounds like you're somewhat apologetic. Sorry, I'm teaching the fiction craft class this year semester. So, but it sounds like you're somewhat apologetic about just a very necessary thing that I think you do really wonderfully actually in the book, which is to take you know, a person and like their somatic experience and actually try to, you know, go through what that might be like in a landscape in a particular time, where they sometimes don't have to be moving all the time, but yet there's inner turmoil, there's inner conflict. And so it doesn't seem as though, it seems like you're really sort of apologizing for it, but I thought, from what I'm, you know, reading this, I mean, I got it in like 2015 and, you know, won't get into what circumstances, but like, but I really enjoyed, you know, a great deal of this. And so I'm wondering where some of this is coming from. Is it because like, you're like, oh, just the older, wiser, and just somewhat ashamed of what, you know, not ashamed, but like, you know, like, oh, I could do better now. But of course we could all do better in like 5 years, 10 years, you know? So I don't know, I guess that's two questions, like what happened, but it also just kind of a like I think you're doing, it's a wonderful book. It's wonderful. I mean, you're doing precisely what, you know, we ask for in like something that's rendering psychological experience of you know, certain characters in certain situations, in particular in like the wilderness or in a swamp or in a flood. Like in a flood, you're of course being inundated with this sort of imagery of having to like, you know, always being sort of, you know, stuck, but while moving, you know? So I think it's, to me, fantastic, so.
Well, thank you very much. I don't mean to come across as apologetic, because you know, there's a enough distance, I think, with the book where like, I feel like I can see it for the first real time, right? Like when the book first comes out, you're defensive of it. You want to protect it, and you want it to do well because you remember the amount of work you recently put into it and waited for it. And once you get that distance and a reading forces you to reread the book, then you can finally see a little bit more clearly about like what its foibles are. And all books have foibles, right? And there are parts that I still very much enjoy, right? And I think like, I hope that everyone here like at some point reviews old work and is embarrassed by it. Because what that suggests is that like, well, you've gotten better, right? So that you can at least identify that. The fact that I still like parts of it is probably not a good sign. But I also think that like the book is not the writer, right? The book is the process in which the writer grows, right? The end product is the writer itself, right? So I think it's like the value in being able to look at a work and see where it's not doing enough or how you would do it differently. Now, I think, you know, like when you're a young writer, like an MFA program, first year, second year, like, I don't know if it's true, but I still kind of hope that everyone here still has a little bit of arrogance left, right? Like you're assigned to work like this one, and you're like, I can beat that. I can definitely beat that. Right? Because that's certainly like the way I felt. Scott, like Jason, like is that like part of like, because you need that, right? Because you need to the world doesn't need another one of this, because there already is one of this. They need something that advances the conversation and takes this craft that you do to some place different, some place that we haven't been before. And in so doing, it makes you different and takes you someplace you haven't been before, right? And that's sort of the highest and greatest value of programs like this and this field in general. I don't know. All right, I guess. Stop talking.